It is statistically proven that when humans are faced with two competing hypotheses, we are more likely to choose the most complex one. This phenomenon is called complexity bias, and it is a logical fallacy. Although it seems contradictory to me, based on my personal valuation of most humans, the tendency to oversimplify is actually unnatural to humans. Oversimplification, the inverse of complexity bias, is also a logical fallacy, and occurs when we attempt to make something appear simpler by ignoring certain relevant complexities. Indeed, simplification is sometimes pragmatic. Admittedly, the world can be a convoluted place, and we need to ignore certain factors in order to understand certain complex ideas. But in many cases, deliberate oversimplification is required to sell flawed ideas, because complex evaluation of those ideas would expose their inherent flaws. Thus, the process of oversimplification becomes a deliberate attempt to alter and manipulate a person's perception of reality. In other words, the act of oversimplification can, and often is, weaponized and exploited for political purposes. To avoid the fallacy of oversimplification, one needs to become comfortable with accepting complicated answers to certain questions. In the words of the contributors of the book, Bad Arguments, 100 of the Most Important Fallacies in Western Philosophy, quote, "When we obscure, ignore, or simply fail to identify certain factors, we run a high risk of misunderstanding reality. If we try to address an issue on the basis of this mistaken understanding, there is a good chance our actions will, at best, be ineffective, or, at worst, exacerbate the very problem we are trying to solve." Unquote. Mass oversimplification is the problem we face today when it comes to race and racial differences. When humans look at the differences between subgroups of any other species, we immediately accept and acknowledge the complexity of that species' biodiversity, whether it's for ideological or moral purposes, or whether it's because we often forget that we are in fact animals. Our own species is the only species on Earth that we apply the standard of deliberately oversimplifying our biological diversities. Certainly, human intraspecies diversity is not as great as some other species, but human population groups did evolve independently for tens of thousands of years under the pressures of different environmental conditions. And these pressures created noteworthy differences that will not simply disappear overnight because we ignore or deny them. And while human subgroups are much closer genetically than, say, a Great Dane is to a Chihuahua, denying the existence of unique human population groups, or reducing our intraspecies diversity to something as trivial as the color of our skin, is obviously unscientific and completely lowbrow. And yet, most people within our society, including most people who identify as conservatives, are perfectly content with maintaining a deliberately reductionistic and even denialistic viewpoint when it comes to racial differences. But why? We all instinctually know the answer to this question, but I found it difficult to distill and articulate the root cause, which in my mind generally means that it's a topic worth analyzing. Lately, we've seen a trend of leftists deeming anyone who opposes their dogmatic worldview as a purveyor of evil. Conservative commentators who, at face value, seem in genuine opposition of this trend, react by falling into the ideological trap of deflecting leftist moralistic attacks by endorsing leftist and liberal dogmatic positions. For example, while arguing in seemingly genuine opposition to left-wing racialist attitudes, conservative pundit Dan Bongino recently proclaimed that race doesn't exist and is a social construction. So in his attempt to combat the left, Bongino adopted an objectively leftist dogmatic viewpoint that claims race is a societal fabrication, not a biological reality, and the left wins. Similarly, last week I saw neoconservative pundit Michael Knowles parrot the leftist narrative that replacement theory is a quote-unquote white supremacist conspiracy theory, which is again taking an objectively leftist position and strengthening the notion that demographics, and thus the demographic makeup of Western countries, is irrelevant to the cultural and political destiny of the country. The left wins again. You're probably all well aware of this now infamous tweet from Little Benny Shapiro, which expresses the view that demographics is irrelevant with the intent of displaying, "I'm no white supremacist, okay folks?" The left wins again. Once you realize this increasingly leftward trajectory of allegedly conservative voices, it's utterly demoralizing. This behavioral pattern of people who are considered on the right capitulating, whether knowingly or unknowingly, to leftist positions, and even spewing their dogma in some fruitless effort to prove that they aren't the real racists, has become so obvious and gross that it's becoming a genuine meme. Sadly, this is proof, if anything, that the left is completely in control of the mainstream right. They are literally controlling their opposition, even if indirectly, by constantly keeping them on the defense and luring them into these ideological traps that always end up with conservatives kowtowing to their propaganda and adopting increasingly leftist positions. And this made me ask myself, what has made this phenomenon possible? I concluded eventually that the key factor for creating this phenomenon and keeping it alive was instilling and normalizing a very specific strain of willful ignorance into the population at large. And that specific strain of willful ignorance is a reductionistic and even denialistic attitude when it comes to race and racial differences. In Western societies, the question of whether human population groups have anything more than just trivial differences has become the most extreme of politically incorrect topics. It makes most people extremely uncomfortable and triggers acute cognitive dissonance because it refutes the nonsensical egalitarian dogma that we've all been force-fed and told is irrefutable truth since birth by nearly every engine of propaganda imaginable. Most people willfully kowtow to this political correctness, sometimes for the sake of diplomacy, but also for social and political expediency, and to insulate themselves from their political enemies. It is essentially a virtue signal, because deep down, most people are well aware that race exists, and racial differences are not as trivial as we are allowed to portray. This socio-cultural praxis ensures that the default position is to deny and diminish human biodiversity instead of acknowledging and highlighting it. To acknowledge and highlight it is deemed verboten and evil. Thus, regurgitating some thought-terminating cliche like "we're all one race, the human race," is regarded by larger society as some kind of enlightened or virtuous position, even for the vast majority of people who consider themselves to be on the right of the political spectrum. And such rhetoric is really no different than the practice of deliberately minimizing human biological differences to something as trivial as skin color. As most of us here are aware, there are fairly significant differences between human population groups. Average skeletal shape and size, average muscle mass and density, hair color, texture, and location thickness of body hair, eye shape, size, color and vision differences, facial shape and structure, and the list goes on and on. Some diseases are even exclusive to one group of humans and completely non-existent in others. Recently, while having a precautionary electrocardiogram done, a health professional notified me that different races of people have different parameters when it comes to what is considered a healthy or unhealthy heart signal. And this is not even touching on psychological or socio-behavioral differences, which objectively exist according to any honest psychometrician or social scientist. These are not minute, superficial differences to anyone with a shred of intellectual honesty. A holistic and realistic, not reductionistic and denialistic approach must be taken when analyzing something with as much complexity as human biodiversity. An honest and healthy society would emphasize a scientific approach to race and racial differences. Social concerns and people's fragile sensibilities would be ignored, and reducing the difference between a European and a Sub-Saharan African to the mere color of our skin would be mocked for the absurdity that it is. People defending the liberal, globalist cultural praxis of race denialism and reductionism often rationalize it by pointing to the fact that racial differences were so often used to rationalize immoral discrimination in the past. But do we really need to deny reality in order to treat each other with basic human dignity? I would say resoundingly no. Race reductionism and denialism is one of the most harmful psychological blights that afflicts Western societies. By convincing the masses that race is irrelevant and that all human population groups are equivalent, globalist liberal elites have by default convinced the masses that human groups are interchangeable, and thus that demographics are irrelevant to the cultural and political destiny of our nations. As the authors of Bad Arguments noted, reductionism and denialism deprive us of the ability to acknowledge the truth, and thus makes the possibility of creating effective solutions and taking effective actions impossible. The self-deceit of race reductionism and denialism makes multiracialism, which invariably mutates into multiculturalism, a seemingly valid ideology, even though this ideology is premised on the falsehoods of relativism and egalitarianism, ideologies that are sure to bring about the end of any order intellectually conceivable to man. Globalist liberal race reductionism/denialism is the bedrock upon which failed multiracial ideologies like civic liberal multinationalism and Marxist international socialism were built. If and when this assumptive default oversimplification is removed, these ideologies fall apart almost immediately at their seams, as they are entirely dependent upon willful ignorance and the praxis of that willful ignorance. Our only hope in ever replacing these ideologies is if science and realism replace dogma and reductionism as the orthodoxy when it comes to human biodiversity.